Hello, and welcome to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're going to be talking about your legal writing class and legal writing in general, and how you can become great at it. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Allison Monahan and Lee Burgess, that's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, the Catapult Conference, and the Trebuchet Legal Career site. Allison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review on iTunes. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're going to be talking about legal research and writing. So without further ado, let's get started.
If you are a new law student, you are likely enrolled in a legal research and writing class, or in some schools, they call it legal research, writing, and analysis, LRWA. This is one of those classes that can really strike fear into the hearts of law students. It was kind of intimidating for me, Allison. Were you intimidated by your legal writing class when you started law school?
I was to a certain extent. I mean, to be honest, I mostly just found it sort of boring. Particularly, I remember not really liking the book that they gave us that we were supposed to be working out of. A sort of like your primer on legal writing and research didn't seem like it was really that helpful. So I don't think I did particularly well in the first sort of couple of assignments that we had. So I remember, going to talk to my legal writing professor and just being like, I don't understand. Like, what are you looking for? Like, I just remember it being incredibly time consuming as well.
I think that's one of the things that makes LRW so difficult for most students is that the papers and the assignments can become incredibly time consuming and challenging. I think you can really go into a black hole of just spending a lot of your free time working on these assignments.
Yeah, definitely. It always seemed like they sort of fell at the worst possible times. It would be like right before a break or something, you'd have a paper due. I remember just spending like hours and hours and hours, like trying to find the right cases and doing the research and writing. And it can really kind of block out everything else you need to be working on.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's also something about having to write in this different way than you might have been writing before that also can make legal writing so challenging for a lot of students.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people in law school think that they're pretty good writers, right? I mean, you don't go to law school if you think you're a terrible writer.
One would hope not.
Right. It's just not, that's just not where you end up.
Yeah.
So I think for a lot of people, particularly, the sort of stereotype of the law student who didn't really know what to do with their lives. And they're an English major and they're good at writing and they want to be writers. I mean, if you want to be a writer, go be a writer. You go to journalism school. Don't go to law school. But, in fairness, lawyers, writing is basically what most lawyers do.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an incredibly important skill set. But I think it's important to realize that's different than the writing that a journalist might do or a novelist might do. It's a very, very specific type of writing.
I also think that citations in the blue book and things like that can be very intimidating for folks. And unless you come from a science background, or I was a psychology major and we had to footnote everything, I think that can create a lot of angst for law students when they realize they have to literally cite almost every sentence in everything that they write.
Yeah, I guess there are two pieces to that puzzle. One is the fact that you have to actually have support for the statements that you're making. But two is just literally doing the citations in this blue book format, I think is very confusing oftentimes.
Yes.
Because it's not like I was a sociology major. I wrote a thesis. I had done citations before, but the blue book is just a whole other can of worms.
It is. And I think people really underestimate the time and energy it takes to do blue book citations.
It is so boring.
So boring. And it takes a lot of attention to detail, and you should not do it at 4 a.m. before your assignment is due.
No, definitely not. I remember my moot court partner decided he was going to find and replace some specific citation maybe an hour before our documents were due. And he accidentally screwed up like every citation in the paper, and it was just a complete and total nightmare.
Yeah.
So don't do that.
Yeah, that's a bad idea.
I was just like, you did what? Like, why are you making major edits to your citations an hour before we have to turn this in? Like, I'm going to kill you right now.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's like it just makes you cringe.
It does make you cringe. It does make you cringe. So there are things that make these classes really challenging, but there are a lot of different types of legal writing assignments that you might actually see over the course of legal writing. You may have legal writing for a semester, you may have a year worth of legal writing, but there are going to be different options. So there are a few different types of assignments, such as those where we call it a closed universe versus an open universe. So these classes aren't just focused on writing, they're usually focused on research and writing. Sometimes they might give you a packet of cases and statutes that you have to work from, or oftentimes later in the semester or the year, they actually require you to go out and do all of your own legal research. Allison, did you have both of these types of assignments as part of your legal writing program?
Yeah, we had a semester course, and I think, the closed universe assignment is sort of like the training wheels approach. It's like you're not going to just go out and ride the bicycle. They're going to give you some training wheels first. So you're probably going to, your initial assignments in legal writing are probably going to have some sort of closed universe aspect to them. Either, you'll be told where to look for the research and you go do the research, or they give you literally like, here's the information, here are the cases that are relevant to this assignment, here are the statutes that are relevant to this assignment. And I think most schools are like that because it's, to really throw you in the deep end of just being like, oh, here's a problem, like go solve it. I think it's just too much.
Yeah, I think so. Ours was an entire year, although the second semester, the class ended halfway through the semester. So maybe it's like 2/3 of a year. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But the fall was all closed universe, and then the spring was open universe assignments.
Yeah, so ours was like we had 1 semester of legal writing, and then we had 1 semester of moot court.
We also did moot court, but it was the last part of that semester we didn't have legal writing. So it was about the same.
Yeah.
It was a little bit different.
Yeah, basically about the same.
Okay, so you have these different types of assignments that will really require you to do research in a different way. Do you think one of them is easier than the other, Allison? Closed versus open?
Well, I mean, I think the closed universe assignment inherently is sort of easier because it's more constrained. The problem with these open universe assignments is that there's probably always that one more case that you could go look for. And people get really obsessed about finding like more cases than their classmates or whatever. Whereas at least with the open or the closed universe, at least you're like, okay, these are the materials that I have to work with. And the other thing is if you do something later for the writing competition to get on a journal, that's also typically a closed universe assignment. So, it's good practice in your legal writing class for these later assignments as well.
It's true. I think closed universe assignments were sometimes frustrating to me because I'm an information collector, and so I like to go out and read more that was given to me. But once I realized that they were basically a puzzle or a game, and you were given the pieces of the puzzle and you had to put them together, they started to make a little more sense to me.
Yeah, and let me just ask you one thing. When we're talking about legal writing, are you also thinking of exams, or are you thinking of this as something totally different?
I think this is totally different, although we didn't really have exams in our legal writing class. We had papers.
But I was thinking of substantive exams.
Oh, substantive exams. No, I'm talking pretty much just about your legal research and writing class.
Okay.
Because we'll talk probably in a future podcast about open book exams versus closed book exams. Those are a little bit different.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap between your legal writing assignment in your legal writing class and writing a law school exam, but I agree with you. They're a different beast.
Yeah. But the skills needed for one are often the skills needed for the other.
Right, because you're learning to do analysis and you're making an argument, you're thinking clearly, writing clearly. It's just a bit, obviously the stuff that you turn in for your legal writing class is going to be a lot more polished because you're not taking it in a 3 or 4 hour test.
Right.
You're really dotting your I's, crossing your T's, making sure all the italics are perfect. It has to be a very perfect document is what you're really looking for.
The other thing that's important to note when you're kind of learning about your different types of assignments is whether you are writing in an objective way or persuasive way. Because
what do you mean by that?
Well, some projects are going to be like an objective memo. Oftentimes this is simulating you're writing for a boss at your law firm, where you've gone out and done a lot of research and you're just weighing the research. You're not picking a side, versus persuasive memorandums, which are often things that would be filed with the court. And then you are standing on your soapbox and arguing for one side, as you would, if you were going to court.
Yeah, and I think that is an interesting point, because when you're thinking of, the objective memo, that's literally, as you point out, like, the partner in the law firm doesn't really understand necessarily what the law is on a topic. Or say the client comes to them and says, we're thinking of doing this thing. Do you think it's legal? At that point, you don't want to make an argument from the client's perspective, necessarily saying, yes, this is definitely legal. Like, they're really asking you for a balanced representation. What is the law? What are you considering doing? How do those things map onto each other? And that's a very different tone than something that you would file if you're in a litigation, where you're saying, my client is right, your client is wrong, I should win. Mm-hmm. And I think sometimes students don't understand the tone difference between those things.
And that the tone difference is actually persuasive through the entire assignment. I think that's something that sometimes people forget too. Oftentimes both types of memos will have a statement of facts, for instance, where you basically summarize the facts of what's going on. And an objective memorandum, those facts need to be objective. You're just discussing the facts. You're just
saying what they are.
Right, exactly. But, in a persuasive memo, you would never, say, and then, my client brutally killed somebody else. Right?
Right.
It would not be
it would be like, a dead body was discovered.
Right, exactly. And then
my client had nothing to do with this.
Right, and then so-and-so died. Period.
Yes, and then unfortunately, person X perished.
Exactly. So, you really have to be comfortable writing in these different voices. And you really have to, I think, embrace these different voices, because I think writing in a persuasive tone is more fun, because you do get to be a little bit more creative, but you want it to feel very different than your objective writing.
Yeah, I sometimes have students who say, well, is it cheating if I'm writing a persuasive memo and I'm writing a statement of facts and I I want to leave out, or I want to leave out something that's like unfavorable to my client? It's like, well, in the real life, you would leave that out, and then you would probably have to negotiate with the other side about like a joint statement of facts, but you don't put it in there the first time around.
Or you bury it and make it seem very...
Right, you characterize it in a different way that's not as damning.
Exactly.
Obviously, you don't want to lie, but there's shades of these. And this is one of the things that people should be paying attention to in their legal writing, is how do you, and it seems a little sleazy almost, like, but how do you shade, how do you shade the facts in a way that, you can get away with in court, basically.
Yeah, it's true. And, one of the things that can be kind of fun if you get really geeky about your legal writing class is that sometimes these exercises can actually be fairly entertaining. I think especially when you are role-playing like you're part of a litigation, because your job then becomes to pick apart other people's arguments or anticipate other people's arguments. I remember practicing, one of my first jobs on a litigation that I did was responding to just a pile of motions eliminate, just a huge pile the plaintiff's side had filed. And it became like a game, because I would find things that were wrong in them, and then I would go read the cases they were citing and tell them how they were wrong.
I clerked for a judge, and it was amazing. It's totally shocking the first time that one of the lawyers, this is a federal court, one of the lawyers cites a case, and even in this case actually had a quote from the case, and the other side had also cited the same case, but for the opposite proposition. So at some point you're like, something here is not right. And you go look at the case, and one of the lawyers had actually taken out a not.
Oh my gosh.
And thought they would get away with it.
Yeah.
And you're just like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Like you put an ellipse in for the word not and thought no one was going to notice that? So that's an example of what you cannot get away with in legal writing.
It's very true. And
if the case says one thing, you can't make it say the other thing.
And I think sometimes students get very frustrated with legal writing, because legal writing programs can tend to be very strict. You have to turn in your papers by a very strict deadline. I know at my school, if you turned it in even a minute late, they started deducting points. They would deduct points if you made citation mistakes. They would deduct points if you did not follow the required format as set out by the assignment. And a lot of people think, oh my gosh, this is so rigid. I mean, this is
so
school,
nitpicky.
so
They're
nitpicky,
so mean.
right?
Oh,
yeah.
Until you get a judge.
Exactly. Wait until you get to practicing, because your supervising attorneys and the judges are going to be just as bad, And so learning how to work in this type of environment where these mistakes have real weight to them, it's a good lesson to learn now. Make your mistakes now so you don't make them in practice.
Right, because the reality is, as soon as you do something incredibly stupid, like cite a case for the opposite proposition and take out the not, like, do you think we believe anything you're ever going to say again in court? No. Like, you just destroyed your credibility.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same with any sort of legal writing. Like, as soon as you make that first mistake or that first misstatement or that first mischaracterization, it really raises a red flag about whether the rest of what you're writing is going to be believable. And you don't want your professor thinking that, and you don't want the judge thinking that.
No. And you get better at catching these mistakes the more of this type of work that you do, but you need to take it seriously to get better at it. So
yeah, and I think that's one of the things, the more of these documents that you read, I mean, even, you can read beyond what's given to you in class. You can go out and just read cases. I mean, anything that's filed in court is basically public. Mm-hmm. So if you've been assigned a summary judgment motion and you don't feel like you really have a very good sense of kind of what the right tone is or how these typically read, it's perfectly within your capacity to go on PACER, which is where all of the federal documents reside, and literally pull, 3 or 4 summary judgment motions. Just look up a famous case they probably filed for summary judgment.
Yep.
And you can read them. And, a lot of this stuff is just kind of it's almost like learning a language. Like, you just have to kind of get the rhythm and get the tone of the documents before you can write them yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, that's one of those things that lawyers do all the time. I mean, the first thing that you're not going to, if you're a new associate or, you're working in a nonprofit or whatever, the first time that you get an assignment to do something, you're typically not going to start from scratch. You're going to look for an example.
Right. And firms often my firm had a bank where we could find examples of things.
Yeah, all of them do. That's the whole point of a law firm. It's like you're not like creating this stuff from scratch.
Right.
Like, you're drawing on the collective wisdom. But, the reality is, like, as soon as a firm files something, unless it's under seal, it's a public document. So, you can go and look at it just as easily as someone at the firm can.
Right, which is also another reason to get very good at your legal writing, because it's a public document. Anybody can read it.
Exactly. It's going to be attached to your name forever.
Exactly. So one of the things that you and I have talked about is that legal writing can be challenging for folks, oftentimes depending on your background or your skill set when you come into law school. I know that legal writing for me was challenging at first because I did consider myself a pretty good writer, and I had a tough time kind of conforming to the formula and the way that the legal writing was supposed to be presented. I thought I had great organizational ideas about how to present legal arguments, and it didn't matter if they were great, they were wrong. So, but I think now we start to see that kind of almost groups of students with similar backgrounds or similar struggles find to have legal writing be a challenge for them. So the first one that we have talked about is the English or history major. We often hear from these students that they are finding legal writing challenging. Allison, why do you think that the English history or history majors kind of struggle with legal writing in law school?
Well, I think a lot of these people are sort of invested in the idea that they are good writers in general. But, if what you've been writing is poetry or, a treatise on some specific piece of history where it's kind of, I don't know. I don't really read history, but I don't know what historians do.
I think they write essays on.
Yeah. So an essay on something or other. I think historians are a little different because I think they at least are drawing on evidence. Mm-hmm. I'm sure like my friend who's an English professor would tell me that she's also drawing on evidence, but it's like a different way of using evidence.
I also find that students, especially English majors, are so focused on the way that their prose sounds, because
right, how it sounds.
It's the crafting, the art of the writing, that they lose the fact that law school in the beginning isn't as worried about the craft, as much more worried about having the practical pieces of the puzzle there.
Right, and it becomes very dry, and it doesn't, most legal writing, frankly, doesn't sound that great in the beginning. It becomes very sort of formulaic. The people who tend to do better, actually, initially, are people maybe who've studied philosophy, because if you're a philosopher, you are used to using the concepts of formal logic. And logic is really what legal writing is about. It's not just like, oh, my client shouldn't be guilty because they had like a rough life or whatever. It's like, that's not what we're asking. We're not asking for an essay about like the difficulty of growing up in a bad neighborhood. That's not what this is about. This is about, they're the elements of the crime of assault or battery. And those are, an unintended touching, blah, 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 whatever they are. And you have to literally go through them one by one. And no one really cares about, your client's like mother. But sometimes people want to kind of go off on these tangents that are not, strictly speaking, that relevant.
Right.
And like the creativity issue. If you're used to doing creative writing, that can be a lot more fun than doing legal writing. That's
true. I mean, legal writing, especially when you're not comfortable with it, I think is very boring and frustrating.
It's just, I think it's frustrating. But I think your approach of thinking about it as a game or as a puzzle or a problem can actually make it more interesting, and can make you better at it.
Yeah.
Because then it's like, what are the pieces? And the pieces are basically like these little puzzle pieces of the law, and you fit those pieces together. And then, you go through them one by one, and then you're looking more at it from the perspective of almost like an investigator or something. Well, once you have the law, you can be like, oh, like, what are the pieces of the facts that I can dig into? And it can become kind of fun.
And flash forward to, 3 years from now, these types of closed universe writing assignments are part of the bar exam in almost every state, called the performance test.
Very good point. Very good point.
So you are also laying the foundation by doing these assignments in your legal writing class for passing the bar, which I think the performance test is the best part of the bar exam, because you absolutely don't have to know any law whatsoever to pass it. So you can just work on this craft while you're a 1L in your legal writing class and just get better at it through law school. And then magically you can be successful on this part of the bar exam without having to learn any more law. Doesn't that sound amazing?
I have no doubt that's why I passed the California bar exam. Because
yeah.
I looked at the performance test as just free points for people who are good writers. And I'm like, I am good at legal writing. I can do this.
Yeah.
Whereas my substantive knowledge was definitely not in the upper echelon.
Minimum competency.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But no, I mean, seriously, like, I don't think I would have passed the bar if they hadn't had the performance test.
Yeah. So, and a lot of people struggle with the performance test. So it's just one of those things that you can't say, oh, I'm not good at this, and just like shove it off, because it's going to come back in the future.
Well, and I mean, it's also like, this is what lawyers do.
Well, that's true too.
Even if you think that you're going to be a trial lawyer, like, most of what you do is not standing up in court and giving a closing argument. And if you did, you still had to write the closing argument.
Yeah.
So I think people sometimes underestimate the importance of legal writing as a skill and just think like, oh, I just have to get through this class and I never have to do this again. It's like, no, this is what the profession is about.
Yeah, this is part of your craft.
It is the craft. There's basically nothing else. Yeah. Like, legal research and writing is what lawyers do.
That's true. Sometimes they talk about it, but they still have to do the legal research and writing.
Right. I mean, they still basically, if you're in court, you've still scripted basically what you want to say. You've still scripted essentially your arguments you want to make. You might not get to stand up and just say them, but
right.
You're not going in cold.
It's true. Now, what about science technology majors? Because I think I've seen, as a group of people, science and technology majors do pretty well in legal writing because they're used to writing dry, logical, formulaic papers.
I think they can. I mean, I think sometimes they struggle just because they're not so used to writing in general. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, like, particularly if you have, say, a science or technology major for whom English is not a first language, I think that can be problematic. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, in general, again, these are people who are typically used to thinking in a more structured and more logical way. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that, you have a checklist and then you have to like match the checklist of the law against the facts that you've been given and go through them one by one, very carefully, very specifically, mm-hmm. Is different than someone who's used to, writing poetry.
Right. It's true. You made an interesting point about students where English is not their first language. We have a number of tutoring students that we work with who are kind of in this camp. Why do you think, I mean, of course, I am so impressed at anyone who goes to law school where English is not their first language, because I can't imagine going to law school in my second language.
Oh God, no! I mean, definitely. I mean, it's amazing that anyone even like attempts this.
It's amazing, but I think when you are taking this on, when English is not your first language, what are the elements of legal writing that I think are even more difficult for somebody kind of coming at it from this perspective?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I think one is just literally the writing. You've got to, and typically I think people probably want to team up with someone, whether it's like a classmate for whom English is their native language, or someone in like the writing center or their TA or whatever, because a lot of it is just, lawyers are writing at a pretty high level, and a lot of the sort of mistakes that you might make as a second language learner, just like little things like prepositions, things like that. Like you just want to make sure your writing's as clean as it can be. Mm-hmm. But also I think there's just, in some cases, a lack of exposure to the American system. Mm-hmm. So, you might have less of a conception of kind of like what legal writing looks like. Mm-hmm. So you might have to spend more time, reading extra materials or reviewing, a couple of examples of the document you're being asked to create. I don't know. What do you think?
I think that's a good idea. And also just be ready to do a lot of rewriting as a form of learning. I think, getting feedback on your work from your professors, from a TA, from, a tutor, from your legal, I'm blanking on the name of it, the academic support office. There we go. Yeah. I was like,
and a lot of universities, if you're at a larger university, a lot of universities actually have a writing center. Mm-hmm. And so that can be a great way for law students to get help with their assignments is, they're designed really to help you become a better writer.
Right. And so but just buy into the fact that that is going to be part of the process. And so
that's what you're learning. That's part of the reason that you're in law school in the US, right, is that you want to learn how to write in a way that is like higher than what you're doing now.
What about students who have other learning challenges like ADHD? We see a lot come up with law students or other attention deficits, learning disabilities that can make, I think, some of this legal writing more challenging. What have you seen that students can do to help them be a bit more successful on legal writing when they are kind of coming at it from this perspective?
Well, I think legal writing is one issue, and I think the research in this case is actually like an even bigger issue. Mm-hmm. Because I think it's so easy for people who have ADHD to get overwhelmed mm-hmm. specifically when you have an open universe research assignment. So I think, most people probably have some sense of how they need to organize the information. But I think just being aware from the beginning, and the same thing can apply in legal writing too. If you're writing, a longer document, you're going to need to figure out a way to have structure. And I think that structure can sometimes be challenging. So I think that's just something to be aware of and to work with whatever resources you can find, whether it's going to your legal writing professor and saying, this is an issue that I struggle with. Could you help me like structure my outline for writing the paper? And to do that early, not to wait until like the day before.
Exactly. And also to really focus on the organization of your materials as well as the organization of your work. But especially if you are doing your own legal research, having a binder, keeping cases that you're going to... I always had a binder that had, because I was still printing everything out, that had 2 sections. It was like cases that I decided were like in the yes camp and cases that were not in the yes camp, but I still kept them so I wouldn't find them again.
Yeah, that's annoying when you're like, oh, I'm reading this case. You're like, I read this last week.
Right. Exactly. But
so you've got to have some sort of organization. One tool, technology-wise, that people might find interesting is Trello.
Which we love. Favorites. Trello is like our answer to everything.
Trello. But you can make these boards, and I can envision a really useful board for doing legal research where you can move cases around, they're like little sticky notes basically, but virtual. I can imagine we could just, as well as having your binder, or instead of having your binder, you could have a column where it's like, these are the ones I'm using, these are the ones I'm not using, and these are the ones I still need to read or whatever.
Yeah, and then I could also even see working on your initial outline on Trello so you could move stuff around.
That's a good idea.
Now I'm just having all sorts of Trello dreams right now.
We should totally do a post about this.
Yeah, coming soon. More posts on how much we love Trello, basically.
It's a great resource. It's really fantastic.
It is. Okay, so how do you get better at legal writing? Basically, if you're either worried about it or if you're listening to this and you're in it and you're struggling, what do we need to do to get better at it? What's always your first stop, Allison, on your help list with legal writing?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would encourage people to always do in this scenario is to talk to their professor, because particularly legal writing, these are people whose job it is to help you learn how to do this. And typically, you're dealing with a much smaller group of people. And the idea is that the person who's teaching you really should have the time to work with you one-on-one. And so that's always the first thing. Like, have you talked to your professor about this? Like, what did they say?
Yeah, I think professors can be incredibly helpful. And if your professor is not helpful, look at your other resources at school, like academic support or TA, to see if you can get some additional support.
Right. And if you need help with your research, sometimes as long as you're allowed to talk to them, the law librarians are a great resource that are totally underused. I mean, these people, they're trained, it's their job to do research.
Right.
And so, they might have a suggestion of how to get started on your legal research that you've never even heard of.
Mm-hmm. We also find people get frustrated with legal writing, and so they stop really trying hard on them and they just kind of mail it in. And I think that's really a mistake, because usually you're going to have intermittent assignments throughout the semester, and this is your opportunity to get feedback and go to your professor and learn. So when it gets to the graded exam, you hopefully don't repeat mistakes. So really going all in and making the most of those assignments so you can get the very important feedback that you need.
That's a great point, because most of your substantive classes, you're not going to get a lot of feedback on your writing, but this is really your chance to get feedback on like what you need to do better and what you're doing well and what you need to improve.
One of the other things that I did when I was trying to work on my own legal writing style is, as I was doing my research, I would find court opinions that were doing a similar analysis to what I was being asked to do and really try and mimic them, because I thought they were quite good. And when you're learning something new, sometimes the best way to learn is to mimic other people. And just talk to my son, who likes to mimic all sorts of things that I do now, which is fun. And
well, that's how he learns.
Exactly, all at the same time. But when I started saying, okay, I like how they, framed this argument. I liked the words that they used. Wow, this sounds really clear and concise and clean. I'm going to borrow some of those elements and incorporate them into my legal writing assignment. And then that was the first legal writing assignment that I high scored the class because
Right. And I think, lawyers keep these too. They keep like clip files of if you see a really great brief. I knew lawyers who would print that out and have it in a file in their office. And 10 years later, they might go back and be like, yeah, I want to make that same argument.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So learn from others. And it's okay to, take these tips from the courts or briefs and incorporate it into your own.
Law is all about precedent.
It is. So what about focusing on, this IRAC formula or using the pieces of the IRAC in legal writing? Do you kind of always have to have those elements in your legal writing to be successful?
Well, it obviously depends on what your professor wants. And this is a class where, more than any other, your job is to figure out, in some ways, what your professor is looking for. And sometimes they'll tell you, sometimes they won't. But in the basic elements of IRAC, what's the issue? What's the rule that we're using? And then doing your analysis and drawing a conclusion, I think, have to be in anything. As far as, whether the exact structure has to be the issue is, the rule is, that really varies. But certainly in the beginning, I think it's worth doing that just to make sure that you've got all of those pieces in there.
And it's okay if it sounds formulaic and it's simple language and you don't think it sounds particularly, quote, lawyerly in the beginning, because you're not supposed to sound like a very experienced lawyer. You're not one. You're typically a first-year law student.
Well, but the other side of that coin is, even for a very sophisticated lawyer, often their goal is to simplify. Mm-hmm. Students sometimes think you have to have this like amazingly complicated argument. But the best lawyers I knew were able to explain things in the simplest terms, because that's what gets the jury on board. That's what gets the judge on board. If I, as a clerk, if I was reading a brief and that brief said, the 3 key things we need to decide are X, Y, and Z. Here's why my client should win on X. Here's why they should win on Y. Here's why they should win on Z. I'm like, oh, okay, that's great. If it was like, we're going to create like an entirely new bloody da, and they're like going in its flowery language, I'm like, what are you talking about? Just like get to the point.
It's true. And don't use the words that you think make yourself sound lawyerly, like
no Latin. Or the Latin. Like, I still don't know what inter alia means. You know, like, I was like top of my class at Columbia. I can't tell you what inter alia. Just use the English. Like, it doesn't make you sound smart to use Latin. It's just annoying.
So
what is it, like, among other things? I don't even know. It's just like, use the English.
Yeah, I stopped. Yeah. And you never see that stuff in practice really either. So,
well, sometimes you do, and you're like, God, this person is so pompous.
That's true. So just like if you're, remember when you were studying another language or you were a kid and you were learning something hard, you always start learning simple things, simple statements, simple sentences, and then you get more complicated as you get more comfortable. And so you can always just remember, if you're feeling like your writing is a little formulaic and dry, you're just in the beginning stages, and you can continue to work to make it feel more sophisticated and more refined, yet still very direct and simple and easy to
right. You
to
can make a
absorb.
Sophisticated argument, but in a simple
Exactly.
way of writing. That's your goal.
And what is, one of the other things we have talked about, and actually a new member of our team was speaking to us about, was the importance of really focusing in on details and being very specific about facts and about law. Allison, could you elaborate a little more on that?
Well, I mean, that's what lawyers do. Lawyers are nitpicky. So I think sometimes students underestimate the degree to which they need to be specific, and that they need to be careful in terms of categorizing the facts. So, if you have an assignment, your professor has picked those facts for a reason. And for you to mischaracterize the facts, it's not like that's missing the point. So, if there's a whole discussion of a close issue, and in your legal writing, you say, well, clearly, blah, blah, blah. It's like, clearly? Really?
Mm-hmm. It's true. So just things to continue to think about, oftentimes being that kind of detail-oriented or looking in at the specifics.
Anal retentive, we could say.
Or anal retentive isn't maybe how you had to be before you entered law school, but it is very important to inject that into all of your legal work, whether it's your legal writing class or your law school classes and exams.
Yeah, because that's the point. I mean, that's what we argue about as lawyers are, these nitpicky details.
Yeah. All right. Well, we hope that this has given you a good primer on being successful in your legal writing class. But with that, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on iTunes. We'd really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything in the future. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or Allison at Lee, Lee, at lawschooltoolbox.com, or Allison, Alison, at lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon. Good luck with your first year of law school.